it's 11 pages. So it's different. So understand that. And it takes time to format your CV for not only for Europe as a general, but also for that particular culture and that country you're targeting. Yeah.
Regarding the length of terms, are they like for shorter term positions? Are they generally renewable, or?
Yeah, they are. It depends on the actual funding. So if it's soft money or hard money, but in most cases, if you're brought in, there's generally opportunities. If not directly on that, there's generally opportunities to follow up.
Okay.
You will need to be proactive with that, but it's yeah, there are possibilities. I would not say it's guaranteed. And each circumstance obviously is different, but my experience is that there are opportunities. Now, you have to keep in mind you are competing with also whatever domestic talent that's going for the same positions. And so, you would have to show why you are to be hired. What skills would you be bringing that would help? So,
even when you're renewing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think it's easier to renew than get the first one. Getting the first one is not easy, and it's in some ways you need a little bit of serendipity, timing, as well as working your networks. That your networks can, for lack of a better word, vouch for you, as well as let you know of the opportunities that are there. Yeah. That's a great segue, because that's really the end of the formal talking points that I have and things that I want to impart. And so this is more question and answer. So anything people want to ask or have a discussion about or talk. But those are just some of the key things, I think, to not only bring awareness to, but also just prepare yourself before you go. Yeah.
I'm just curious, because you said your goal was short-term initially, and now it's been, what you said, 8
years. Yeah.
8 years. What was it that led to you deciding to stay longer? And
I don't know, to be honest. So I was originally hired, so my wife was on a Fulbright for 9 months. I was hired on a 9-month contract to match hers. Within 3 months of being there, they offered me a permanent spot, a permanent position. And I was the first international hire in admin in my university. And I was the first, I believe, international from North America, or non-European, to be hired in Finland and do an admin position. So I was an anomaly in that sense. But they offered me the opportunity, and my wife wanted to stay and still collect some more research. So it was more of, okay, this is a good fit. And then we had a daughter, and it was still good work and interesting work, and it just kind of snowballed from there. So our intentionality was short-term, but then it turned into long-term, mainly because of the opportunities that we were able to create for ourselves and that were presented to us, as well as the lifestyle. We like the life there. So yeah, there's some challenges to it. So in wintertime, we have, like in December, we'll maybe have 2 or 3 hours of daylight a day. In the summer, we have 24-hour daylight, which I can't, that really bothers me. I can't sleep. So I get insomnia in the summer because of it. But, I mean, there's some really wonderful things there. The work culture, I find very refreshing. It's very supportive. And it's encouraging. With my grant from the National Academy there, I have, comparatively to, I've worked on NSF grants and NIH grants here, the oversight is minimal, almost none. I have to submit maybe a half page every year about what I'm doing and what it, yeah. So it's, when I want something or to do something, I propose it and they say yes or no, and it just, but that's my university and that's my situation there. In other parts of Europe, it's different. But for me, when I went, it was one of these opportunities that, you know, okay, I'll do this. And then I was doing some job interviews. I actually, my first year that I interviewed for a job in Denver and I interviewed for a job in London, but we ended up staying. So,
Interesting story.
yeah.
I'm sure you mentioned this before I came in late, but did you speak Finnish?
No, I did not. And that was a challenge.
Yeah.
And depending on who you talk to now, they may say I do or do not now.
Yeah.
So,
There's some level of proficiency.
yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you're going for a job in a country, I would highly encourage you to develop the language skills. Academia, it's pretty easy to work in English. There are a lot of opportunities to teach in English in a variety of ways. But at the end of the day, they will want you to speak the language, and I would encourage that too. Just getting around town to ordering food at a restaurant, understanding what's on the labels of food. I mean, if you look at, I think this is primarily in English, but there's some Finnish on the label there of just understanding what are the ingredients, things like that. So it has been also one of those things that I have taken on time outside of my work to study. So my first couple of years I took courses, and then the last couple of years I've had a private tutor. And I usually have about 2 to 3 hours of private instruction a week, and then I have homework. So even in, you know, after schooling, you still get homework. I do maybe an hour to 2 hours, sometimes 3, depending on the week, of writing, listening, reading, finish. So yeah. Yeah.
Based on your travels and your experiences, would you know which countries currently in EU are more open or accepting of international applicants? And second question I have is that how open these universities are for international applicants to come and work in international context, not in their local or domestic context?
I would say it's not necessarily as much country-based as institutional-based. So you will find institutions that are much more international friendly rather than particular countries. I know of some in Germany that are very much that way, but I also know some in Germany that are very much the other way. And that also goes down to your question about topics and interests there. Again, it depends on the department and the focus of the research on that institution as well as that particular department. I am lucky that the institute and the department that I belong to within my institute, we focus on international topics. Now, in Europe, in general, it's easier to find international outward-looking departments because there is a lot of the funding in Europe is at the European level. The big money is at the European level. So to do any large-scale research, whether you're in the sciences or social sciences or like education, you want to get the ERC grants. You want to get the Erasmus Plus, those type of things. To do that, you have to have consortiums, multi-country consortiums. And so with that, there's a lot more opportunities to do comparative work. And you know, when I first got there, I would see these comparative pieces, like Portugal and Finland pieces. I'm like, okay, why does this matter? But it fits into a larger context of multiple perspectives of different comparative pieces on different aspects. And so what is generated though is a very much more, I would say, international focus than I found my experience to be here in the U.S. Now granted, my experience in the U.S. was, again, about 8 years ago, and institutionally specific where I was. But that's kind of my perspective on that. So if there are particular areas you are interested in, and not geographic areas, but topical areas, those are things that there are specialty, like professional associations, if you will, for those topics within Europe. You can look there, and then you can see which institutions are represented there, which departments are there, and that's would be probably the way I would go, or encourage you. It would be the first step to identifying who will be internationally looking in my topic. I don't know if that helps or makes sense.
So I'm sort of curious, thinking, I think there are a couple of questions connected to your last comment. So international work that might be Finland and Portugal, or comparative work. If we think of international as outside the EU, I'm curious about how much that's understood, and I guess I'd like to sort of situate it in a context of, certainly in the US and from a distance in Europe, rising xenophobia, nationalism.
Yeah.
So if we look around this room, we say we have a collection of really talented graduate students who'd like to consider how feasible is it for me to work in another country and in Europe. To what extent is there international hires, but a strong preference for international hires from certain locations, and whether that's about their academic location, their disciplinary location, or their nationality. Could you talk a little bit about that? And I'm sure there's enormous variation within
There is enormous variation, but I would say there is opportunity within disciplines, within the topical area. If you have an expertise or a background or skills on a specific topic that someone is researching, there's opportunities, regardless of your nationality, whether you come from Africa, North America, South America, Asia, wherever. There is various degrees of openness to that depending on the particular grant or professor who was running that search. But I would say there is, if you have those skills, they'll want to hire you. They'll want to hire you. If I had to characterize the skills that are desired the most, it's quantitative research methods. One of the reasons why I was able to parlay a lot of my work is I have a background in statistics, I have a background in large-scale data management, and people with that background in Europe typically are not in education. They're not in social sciences research as much. They're in public policy, they're in economics, they're in other areas. They exist, they're there, but they're not necessarily, you see that there. I had to do an extensive reading to build up my sociological theory. I had theory, I had that background, but I got there and it became very evident very quickly that these PhD students, they knew much more about sociological theory and how these things work and fit together than I did. And so it was, my homework was reading. I read a lot. But for skill-wise, you can really stand out if you have particularly the quantitative research methods in here. There's a dire need of that, particularly in the social sciences and education, in my opinion. So my area is higher education, and on my hand I can count, 12 to 15 researchers I know in Europe, and there's more than that, but it's if you look at the journals and what is written, it's much more theoretical driven, it's much more policy driven in that sense, rather than quantitative methods and outcomes from that.
Let me just follow up. So, to what extent U.S. search committees have some pretty conventional ways of how we would read a vita, how we read a letter, what we're looking for. And I'm curious, so you've got a different format, but what is going to pop out? For example, we might say it's very important to establish yourself as a researcher through publication. I mean, some advisors would really stress that. What seems to be the sort of coin, the currency that matters as people look at these?
Let me answer that in two different ways. So if you want an academic job, actually, there are a number of non-academic jobs available. So these are in groups that are primarily located around Brussels, where the EU is located. But these are groups like EUA, European Universities Association, European Universities Association, EduQuals, eQuals, which is their quality assurance. All these professional associations like this, they are looking for a lot of experience working with World Bank, OECD projects, things like this. Do you use the same language in your cover letter, in your work, as these reports? These are non-academic reports, but these are reports that are very much paid attention to by these associations there. I've had discussions about job opportunities in Brussels with a couple different groups. There's a couple located in Paris as well. But understanding that language, it's a very, if I had to classify, it's a very neoliberal language. And you understand that, and that this is how you need to frame your cover letter and how you sell yourself. For the academic jobs, it is what they look for is twofold. One, are you a part of their network? So their networks are this goes back to the importance of the networks. Have you published with, or is one of your major professors somebody that they know or is in their circle, if you will. The other thing is the bigger currency in Europe is books, not necessarily journals. Journal articles are gaining currency, and there's various reasons for this. But books are sought after and are looked at as much more. If you write a book, then this is the greatest thing, and then you go on basically a speaking tour. Mm-hmm. You get invited to all these keynotes, talks, and things around Europe, and it's whereas if you write a journal article, you don't necessarily see that as much. Journal articles matter. But the journals, which journals per se don't matter as much, if you will. There's important journals to write in, but if you publish a piece in more of like a regional journal, so like I have a piece going into the Nordic Migration Journal of Nordic Migration. So it's very narrowly focused, both topic and geographic region-wise. But that counts just as much as a piece into a journal like Higher Education, which is a very global journal perspective like that. So how that's weighed in that sense. But for them in Europe, in my opinion, it's much more about putting your work into places that resonate with the work rather than trying to target always these 3 journals here in the U.S. in the higher ed. So, yeah.
2 questions. One is when a search committee looks at applicants, do they have, like in the U.S. you just look at them. In Canada you have to put 2 piles, Canadian pile and non-Canadian pile. First go through the Canadian pile. So how does it work in Europe or EU regulations? That's the first. And the second question is, I travel a lot to Europe. I like traveling to Europe because I always feel poor there with my money. But it's much more sophisticated over there. So I know cost of living, housing is really expensive in many places, whereas other things aren't. So if you could just comment about cost of living, university salaries, how comparable is it at the end of the day, etc.
Yeah. Let's do that last. Let's do the search committees. Honestly, I don't have a great experience with the search committees. I have some, and my general sense is that unless the task involves something very specific to the language, so teaching domestic programs, they're not going to limit that.
So my question is about law. There is
Law.
a law.
They
They
cannot discriminate in general.
Europeans don't come first.
My understanding is that is correct.
Okay.
Because when I've applied for things, I have permanent residency,
Okay.
which gives me,
You're not European.
yeah, I'm considered that even though my nationality is still American.
That's okay.
But it's not the nationality, it could be the residency
Yeah.
that
Right.
does that.
Right.
But I get the general sense that it's open, unless there are specific skills needed.
Right.
So like, there are jobs that I can't apply for in Finland simply because, I can apply, but I'll get tossed out because I do not have fluency in Finnish.
Right, but it's not a law of the EU that they first have to, and only if they can't find somebody in the EU can they then.
Right. That's my understanding. I could be wrong in that. I've not been on that side of the table that much. So I've only been involved in one search, and we had a couple internationals, but they were all Europeans. I think about it. So this never came up. Cost of living and things like that. Yeah, it's different country to country. So I have Spanish colleagues who work in Spanish universities. They earn a good salary in Spain, but compared to my salary in Finland, it's much lower. So, but cost of living in Spain is much lower from housing, unless you're in like Barcelona and Madrid. The housing in Madrid is much lower. Where I'm at, the universities in general, the salaries are, median to above median nationally, and depending on what role you're in. So like my salary is actually about one standard deviation above the median in Finland, but it's simply because of the position I have. Not necessarily.
Right. So my question is, here parents need to, from year one, start saving money for the children's college education. You don't need to do that in Finland.
Right.
Healthcare, you don't need to do that in Finland.
Yeah.
There's so many things that you don't need to spend money on.
Right.
So that's why I said at the end of the day, how does it sort of compare?
Yeah. So if I look at my last salary at Georgia, so I worked at University of Georgia last. I add up my taxes, my federal, my state, my copay for health insurance, dental, retirement, all that. It's roughly equal to my tax rate in Finland.
Mhm.
So I pay about, I think my tax rate is 40%. And, but I get a lot out of it too. So now my pension isn't directly covered in that, but everything else is. So my health care, everything else. I get a subsidy from the government for my daughter.
Maternity, paternity leave.
Yep. So like in Finland, we actually have 3 different leaves. There is required maternity leave, then for the mother, then there's paternity leave, and then there's parental leave.
Mm-hmm.
And it adds up to about a year.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but each country is different. The Nordics typically are about that year. It's about that year mark. Whereas you go to the southern Europe, it's significantly less. In the UK, I would say it's more closer to the US. It's a little bit longer, but not much. That's my understanding of that. But, for me, like housing for me takes up about a third of my salary. And I have a good salary, whereas if I was a median salary, housing would take up about a half to maybe a little bit more than that. Food, particularly fresh vegetables and things like this, cost more for me because we have to import it in Finland, whereas Southern Europe it's much cheaper. However, cell phones, my cell phone bill monthly is ridiculously cheap because of the technology and the infrastructure there. I think I pay 12 euros a month for my cell phone bill.
And you have to have a Nokia?
We do not have to have Nokia, but it's very helpful. Yeah, it's. But I think my cell phone bill is like 12 euros a month, and I have unlimited data, text, phone, things like this. And because of EU regulations, I get then 10 gigs of data roaming in any EU country. So when I go abroad, and then the Nordics have come together and they said if whatever your plan is in Europe, so like in Finland, if I go to Denmark or Norway, I get that plan also in that country. So I get basically unlimited in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway too. So you get these EU regulations and then you get these regional things like this. But cell phones are relatively inexpensive to carry, to have. Everybody has it, and you actually need it. I didn't understand this. This goes back to understanding the work and lifestyle culture there. But I didn't understand I needed a smartphone when I first got there. It took me about a year, maybe a year and a half before I got my first smartphone. But that's how everything works. From opening your bank account online, you get a text with your thing. I mean, it's now when I get into my data, one of the data protocols is I have to go through a smartphone and to line up my data protocols to get into the data. So it's, but that's Finland. Whereas this is not necessarily the case in other parts of Europe. But it's, yeah. So did that answer that, or?
No, I mean, it's a difficult question to answer, but I was just curious about how it all sort of...
I think when you start adding up the composite of what you pay here separately for things to the composite you pay on taxes in Europe, there are differences, but there's some rough equivalencies. The difference, I think, is how the things are all managed. So I have socialized healthcare, which, if I want to have a procedure for something that's elective, I get in a queue. And, it's could be a 4-year wait before, 5-year wait before it comes up.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it's something in an emergency, boom, it moves right forward.
Mm-hmm.
When my daughter was born, give you about costs. Her and my wife were in the hospital for a whole week, 5 days.
Okay.
And our hospital bill was less than what I paid to get my daughter's passport and U.S. citizenship documents. So, yeah. My monthly daycare bill is 300 euros a month. And she's there 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., lunch, breakfast, 3 snacks a day, all locally organic sourced. So, I mean, but I get a subsidy from the government, and part of that is paid for by taxes. So it's just a different way of collecting money and distributing it. So,
Does your wife work? And so my question is, for those of us with partners
Yes.
not in academia,
yes.
what do you think it's more challenging, not as challenging as having 2 people in academia?
Yeah. So my wife does work. She is an academia. She just left her last job about 2 weeks ago. And so she worked for about 3.5 years actually out of Amsterdam. So she was in Amsterdam 1 week a month. And then she was also doing a lot of work for the European Commission out of Brussels, and so she was going all over Europe. So she was traveling quite a lot for that. And now she's coming back to Finland, and then she actually, about 3 hours ago, no less than that, 4 hours ago, interviewed for a grant there in Finland, and so she's getting funding, hopefully get funding from the Finnish government there. It is, they do not, in general, European universities do not do spousal hires. You see spousal hires much more prevalent here in the U.S., particularly if you think about like administration positions, or you need academic credentials in certain positions and things like this. But it may not be a teaching research position. So there's much more flexibility there, and much more, I think, encouragement that way to hire people. It's starting to change, but in general, I would say it's not overly accepted in that sense. So in some ways, it's easier to not have a spouse or a partner in academia. With that said, it depends on the visas you get. And if you are, in general, if you are a spouse, whether it's a same-sex couple or non-same-sex couple, you can have access to right to work if your spouse has got the contract. If you are partners, though, no. It's in most cases it's not. So there will be needed the marriage there. It's in academia, while they don't do spousal hires, they will help out on things. They will do. There's a lot more short-term funding in Europe. So I know some colleagues both in Finland and outside of Finland who will take on 8 contracts a year, 6 contracts a year. So some will be for 6 weeks, some will be for 2 months, a couple will be for 3 weeks, and they'll have these short-term contracts. Now, by law, depending on the particular country or governance, but like in Finland, you can only have, I think, like six of these contracts before they have to offer you six contracts, or like 3 years of these contracts before they have to offer you a permanent position or not. So it's in that sense, that's their tenure review process in many ways, in that sense. But there's a lot of opportunities for work, but it's work that I would say doesn't necessarily match up to your research interest. So you're just taking what's coming, and so it's very difficult for young researchers who are not in a good spot, who are in these short-term contracts, to develop a research profile, to develop